The large atrium of the corporate headquarters was quiet, but not the kind of quiet that brings peace. It was a heavy, waiting silence, the kind that exists right before a storm, or in this case, right before a very expensive party. Elias stood in the center of the room, holding a polishing cloth. To anyone else, the marble floor looked perfect, shiny enough to see your reflection in. But Elias saw the smudge near the pillar, a tiny footprint left by a setup crew member hours ago. He sighed, dropped to one knee, and rubbed the stone until it disappeared. Elias was young, in his late 20s, with tired eyes and posture that suggested he was trying to take up as little space as possible. He didn't work here as a businessman or an executive. He worked on the cleaning and setup crew. It wasn't the life he had imagined for himself. But life had a way of changing plans when the money ran out and the bills piled up. In the middle of the room stood the real reason Elias was feeling so anxious today. It was a grand piano, a sleek black Steinway that looked more like a piece of art than an instrument. It sat alone on a raised platform, waiting for the musician who was supposed to arrive later that evening. Elias stared at it while he worked. He knew that piano. He knew the weight of the keys and the specific smell of the wood. He knew that if you pressed the right pedal, the sustain would last for days. He walked toward it slowly, checking his surroundings to make sure no supervisors were watching. This wasn't really his place. He was just the help, the guy who moved chairs and emptied trash cans. But he missed the music. He missed it more than he missed sleeping in a warm bed or eating hot meals. Playing the piano was the only time he ever felt like he actually mattered. Like he had a voice that people wanted to hear. As he got closer to the instrument, he saw his own reflection in the black lacquer. His uniform was cheap and ill-fitting, a stark contrast to the elegance of the piano. He reached out a hand, his fingers hovering just inches above the keys. He wanted to play just one chord, just one note to hear how it sounded in this echoey hall. But he pulled his hand back. If he got caught touching the expensive equipment, he would lose his job. And right now, losing this job meant losing his apartment. "Hey, you there?" The shout snapped Elias out of his trance, and he quickly stepped away from the piano, turning around to face the voice. It was the event manager, a stressed man holding a clipboard and a headset. "Yes, sir," Elias said, keeping his head down. "Stop daydreaming," the manager snapped, not even looking at him as he checked off items on his list. "We have the Gala of Innovation starting in 2 hours. I need the glassware on the tables checked again. And make sure you stay out of the way when the guests arrive. These people are important. They don't want to see the cleaning staff standing around." "Yes, sir." "Right away, sir." Elias walked away, his hands clenching into fists in his pockets. He hated being treated like he was invisible. He hated that people looked at his uniform and decided he had nothing in his head. But he swallowed his pride. He needed the paycheck. He walked over to the banquet tables and began inspecting the champagne flutes. The room was starting to fill up with the smells of the evening catering food, expensive perfume, and the scent of fresh flowers. The mood was shifting. The workers, who had been loud and joking an hour ago, were now silent, rushing to finish their tasks so they could disappear before the real people showed up. Elias could feel the tension in his chest. He wasn't just nervous about doing a good job. He was nervous about being in the same room as the CEO. Miss Sterling was a legend in the business world. She was sharp, brilliant, and famously ruthless. She had built this company from the ground up. Elias admired her even though she had no idea who he was. He remembered reading an article about her once. She said she valued talent above everything else. She said she hated fake people. Elias wondered what she would say if she knew that the guy cleaning her floors was a classically trained pianist who had once played at a national competition. He laughed bitterly to himself. She wouldn't care. In her world, and in this world, you were defined by the suit you wore, not the music you made inside. The lights in the atrium dimmed slightly, changing from the harsh fluorescent bulbs of a workday to the soft golden glow of a party. The transformation was instant. The room looked magical. It looked like a place where dreams came true. Not a place where Elias scrubbed floors for minimum wage. A group of waiters passed by, carrying trays of appetizers. Elias joined the line, grabbing a tray of his own. His job for the night had changed from cleaner to server. He had to stand in the corners and make sure the guests had full drinks. It was the worst part of the job. It meant standing there while people ignored you, or worse, treated you like a piece of furniture. The first guests began to arrive. The sound of heels clicking on the marble floor echoed through the hall. The room filled with laughter and the clinking of glasses. Elias stood near a wall, holding his tray perfectly still, trying to blend into the curtains. He watched the men in their expensive tuxedos and the women in their sparkling gowns. They looked so confident. They owned the space. He watched a group of young executives gather near the bar. They were loud, laughing too hard at each other's jokes, clearly trying to impress each other. One of them, a tall man with a slicked-back haircut, was gesturing wildly with his drink. Elias recognized him. He was a junior manager, someone who always shouted at the cleaning crew if a speck of dust was left on a desk. "Just look at this place," the manager was saying to his friends. "It's perfect. It's almost as perfect as my presentation this morning. Did you see the board's face?" They loved it. Elias looked away. He didn't want to hear it. He focused on the piano again. It was still sitting there in the center of the room, silent and majestic. The hired musician was late. Elias could see the event manager pacing near the entrance, checking his watch and looking nervous. "Where is he?" The manager muttered into his headset. "The CEO is already here." The atmosphere in the room shifted. Miss Sterling had entered. She walked through the crowd like a knife through butter, parting the sea of people. Everyone wanted to shake her hand. Everyone wanted a moment of her time. She smiled politely, but her eyes were scanning the room, always assessing. Elias watched her from his corner. She looked tired, he thought. Being the boss wasn't as easy as it looked. She walked over to a group of investors, shaking hands and nodding. Elias felt a strange sensation in his fingers. It was an itch, a need to play. The silence of the piano was driving him crazy. It was sitting there begging to be played. He looked at the rowdy group near the bar again. They were getting louder, their drinks getting stronger. He had a bad feeling about tonight. The arrogance in the room was palpable. It was like a thick fog that rolled in off the ocean. These people were used to getting what they wanted, and they were used to stepping on anyone below them to get it. And Elias, in his cheap uniform, holding a tray of expensive champagne, was definitely below them. He took a deep breath and tried to steady his hands. He just had to get through the night. Serve the drinks, avoid eye contact, and go home. He repeated this mantra in his head. But as he watched the junior manager from across the room, he saw the man look in his direction. A smirk crossed the manager's face. He nudged his friend and pointed right at Elias. The bad feeling in Elias's gut got heavier. He tightened his grip on the tray. He knew that look. It was the look of a predator that had just found something to play with. The night was far from over, and Elias had a feeling that his attempt to remain invisible was about to fail spectacularly. The room was getting louder. The soft jazz that had been playing from the speakers seemed to disappear under the noise of conversation, laughter, and the clinking of expensive glassware. Elias moved through the crowd like a ghost, his eyes fixed on the floor, offering drinks to anyone who made eye contact. Most people just took a glass without looking at him, treating him like a vending machine. He was doing his best to stay busy, hoping that if he looked occupied, no one would bother him. But he could feel a pair of eyes following him. It was the tall executive in the gray suit, the one he had seen earlier near the bar. The man had been drinking heavily, and his face was flushed red. He was standing with a group of 3 other men, all of them laughing at something that wasn't really funny. Elias tried to steer his tray toward the far side of the room, away from them. But just as he turned, a heavy hand landed on his shoulder. It wasn't a friendly tap. It was a grip that demanded attention. "Hey, waiter," the voice boomed. Elias froze. He could feel the eyes of the guests nearby turning to look. He slowly turned around, keeping his expression neutral. It was the tall executive. Up close, the man smelled like strong cologne and whiskey. "Yes, sir," Elias asked softly. "Can I get you a fresh drink?" The man didn't take a drink. Instead, he looked Elias up and down, a sneer forming on his lips. The man's friends stopped talking and watched, amused looks on their faces. They were sharks, and they smelled blood in the water, the executive said. Loud enough for people standing a few feet away to hear. I was just telling my friends here that the service tonight is interesting. He poked Elias in the chest with a finger. You don't really look like the other servers. You look a bit rough. Are you sure you're supposed to be out here with the guests? Elias felt a hot flush of embarrassment rise up his neck. He straightened his back, clutching the silver tray tighter. I am part of the service team, sir. Is there something wrong with my work? The executive laughed, a harsh, barking sound. Oh, everything is fine, buddy. Don't get your uniform in a twist. We were just talking about how boring this party is. He waved his hand vaguely toward the center of the room, where the grand piano sat silent. The musician is late. Can you believe that? Paid thousands of dollars and the guy doesn't even show up? The group of men chuckled. Elias glanced at the piano. He knew exactly why the musician wasn't there. He had overheard the event manager screaming into the phone earlier about a car accident on the highway. The hall was silent save for the murmur of the crowd. It is a shame, sir, Elias said politely, trying to step back. If you will excuse me, I have other guests to attend to. Wait, the executive said, grabbing his arm again. His grip was tight. Don't run off. We have a problem. We have no music, and a party without music is just sad. He looked at his friends, a wicked glint in his eyes. But look at this guy. He's standing right there. He looks like he has artistic hands. The other men laughed. It was a cruel, mocking laugh. They weren't laughing with Elias. They were laughing at him. Come on, then, the executive urged, pushing Elias slightly toward the piano. Since the pro isn't here, maybe you can save the night. Do you know how to play that thing? Or do you just know how to dust it? Elias felt his heart hammering against his ribs. He looked around the room. People were starting to stare. A small circle of empty space was forming around them. He felt like a trapped animal. Sir, I am just a server, Elias said, his voice trembling slightly. I cannot play. I didn't ask if you could play. I asked if you knew how, the executive taunted. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crisp $20 bill. He slapped it onto Ilias's tray. Here, I'll pay you. $20 to play us a song? Surely that's a week's wages for you, right? The comment stung. It was a direct hit at his financial situation, a reminder that, to these people, he was poor and insignificant. The men laughed louder. One of them whistled. Come on, play. The chant started to ripple through the small group. Elias looked at the money on his tray. It felt dirty. He looked at the sneering face of the executive. The man was enjoying this. He was enjoying humiliating someone he thought was beneath him just to get a laugh from his bosses. I don't want to cause trouble, Elias stammered. Trouble? The executive threw his hands up. I'm trying to give you a tip. A big tip. Unless... He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that everyone could still hear. Unless you can't read music? Is that it? You look at those black and white keys and just see a puzzle you can't solve. The humiliation was washing over Elias in waves. He wanted to run out of the room. He wanted to quit his job and never come back. But he also felt a spark of anger deep in his chest. These people didn't know him. They didn't know he had spent 10 years of his life practicing scales until his fingers bled. They didn't know he had played in concert halls that were fancier than this atrium. I can read music, Elias said quietly. It wasn't a brag. It was just a fact. The executive's eyes lit up. Oh, so he speaks. And he can read. He turned to the crowd. Did you hear that, ladies and gentlemen? Our waiter here is a scholar. He grabbed another drink from a passing tray and took a swig. Okay, hotshot. You say you can read? Let's see it. He pointed a shaking finger at the sheet music sitting on the piano stand. It was a complex piece, full of fast notes and difficult jumps. A piece designed for a master. I bet you $20 you can't even get through the first page without messing up. I can't take your money, Elias said, gripping the tray so hard his knuckles turned white. It's not about the money, kid. It's about the entertainment, The executive sneered. "Come on, don't be a coward. Everyone is waiting." The room had gone quiet now. The laughter had died down, replaced by a thick, uncomfortable tension. People were holding their breaths, watching the drama unfold. It was the most excitement they had all night. Elias looked over the executive's shoulder. Standing across the room, near the entrance, was Ms. Sterling. She had heard the commotion. She wasn't smiling. She was watching the interaction with a cold, hard stare. She didn't look like she was going to step in and stop it. She was watching to see what Elias would do. The executive saw Elias looking past him and turned to see what he was looking at. He saw the CEO and straightened up, puffed out his chest, thinking he was putting on a good show. He turned back to Elias, thinking he had won. "Well?" the man demanded. "Are you going to entertain us, or are you going to stand there looking sorry for yourself?" Elias felt the weight of the tray in his hand. It was heavy. It represented his job, his safety, his invisible status. But the anger inside him was heavier. He was tired of being the butt of the joke. He was tired of being invisible. He slowly pulled the tray away from the executive's reach. He carefully set it down on a small round table nearby. The clink of the glasses sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. "What are you doing?" the executive asked, his smirk faltering slightly. Elias didn't answer. He took off his uniform jacket. He folded it neatly and placed it on top of the tray. Underneath, he was wearing a plain white dress shirt. It was wrinkled from the long day, and the cuffs were slightly frayed. But it was better than the uniform. He walked toward the piano. The crowd parted for him, sensing a shift in the atmosphere. The mocking smiles faded from the faces of the executives. The tall man took a step back, looking suddenly less confident. Elias stepped up onto the platform. The piano loomed in front of him, huge and black. He sat down on the bench. It was leather and cold. He reached out and adjusted the height of the seat, a muscle memory from years of practice. He flexed his fingers, feeling the tension in his joints. The music on the stand was Hungarian Rhapsody No. 2. It was a showpiece. It was flashy, difficult, and loud. The executive had picked it because he thought it would be impossible for a waiter to play. From his seat on the bench, Elias looked out at the room. The tall executive was standing with his arms crossed, a look of arrogant expectation on his face. He was waiting for failure. He was waiting for Elias to embarrass himself so they could all laugh and go back to their drinks. Elias took a deep breath. He closed his eyes for a second, shutting out the lights, the people, and the arrogance. He thought only about the music. He thought about the notes waiting under his fingers. He placed his hands on the keys. They felt cool and solid. The room held its breath. The CEO took a step closer. The tall executive opened his mouth to make one last joke, but before he could speak, Elias's thumbs struck the low C notes. The sound thundered through the atrium, shaking the champagne glasses. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. The sound of that first chord seemed to hang in the air like a storm cloud. It wasn't just loud. It was heavy, filled with a weight that seemed to push against the walls of the expensive atrium. For a second, nobody moved. The tall executive, who had been smirking just a moment ago, flinched as if the sound had physically slapped him. His glass of whiskey trembled in his hand, causing a splash of amber liquid to land on his pristine gray suit. He didn't even notice. Elias didn't look up. He didn't check to see if people were laughing or booing. Once his fingers hit the ivory keys, the rest of the world simply fell away. The dirty floors, the mocking comments, the empty bank account of it dissolved. There was only the vibration of the strings beneath his hands and the rhythm. Pulsing in his chest, he began to play the opening sequence of the piece. It was slow, dramatic, and demanding. His left hand walked down the keyboard in a steady march while his right hand began to weave in the melody. It wasn't hesitant or clumsy. It was firm and confident. The silence in the room changed. A moment ago, the silence had been mocking, waiting for a mistake. Now it was a silence of shock. The low murmur of conversation died completely. Waiters froze in the middle of serving drinks. The clinking of silverware against plates stopped. The only sound in the massive hall was the music. Elias's posture had shifted. When he was standing with his tray, he had looked small, hunched over, trying to hide. Sitting at the piano, he was tall. His back was straight, his shoulders were back, and his head was held high. The cheap white shirt suddenly looked like a costume for a concert pianist. His eyes were closed, his face relaxed. Lost in a world that only he could see, he transitioned into the faster section of the music. The tempo picked up, and the notes began to tumble out like a waterfall. This was the hard part, the part that required years of training to get right. His fingers moved independently of each other, jumping across the keys with a speed that made them look like a blur. The tall executive stared at the stage, his mouth slightly open. He looked at his friends, hoping to exchange a glance that said, "Okay, he knows a little bit, but let's see him mess up the hard part." But his friends weren't looking at him. They were staring at Elias, their eyes wide. One of them, a man who had been laughing the loudest earlier, actually took a step closer to the stage. As if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. The music wasn't just correct. It was filled with emotion. It swelled and dipped, rising too high, crying notes before diving back down into deep, growling lows. It was angry and sad at the same time. It was the sound of a man who had been underestimated one too many times. Finally getting a chance to scream without opening his mouth. Ms. Sterling. The CEO had stopped walking toward the investors. She stood near the back of the room, her arms crossed. She was known for being a tough judge of character. She didn't tolerate incompetence, and she certainly didn't tolerate time wasting. But as she listened, her expression softened. The hard lines around her eyes relaxed. She moved her head slightly, keeping time with the beat. She had heard this piece played by professionals at charity galas many times. She knew how difficult it was. And she knew that the man playing it right now was not a waiter. The piece continued, growing more complex. Elias's hands crossed over each other, the left hand reaching up to play the high notes while the right hand dug deep into the bass. It was a dance of muscle memory and raw talent. He wasn't thinking about the notes anymore. He was feeling them. The piano, which had been a silent, heavy object in the center of the room, was now alive. It was singing, roaring, and breathing. The crowd began to shift. People who had been standing near the bar drifted closer to the stage. The waiters, who had been hiding in the corners, came out to listen. Even the kitchen staff had appeared at the double doors, peering out at the spectacle. Elias could feel the energy of the room, but he didn't let it distract him. In fact, he fed off it. He played a section faster than it was usually written, taking a risk. The sound was thrilling, a cascade of notes that sounded like rain hitting a tin roof. It was flawless. The tall executive was now sweating. The arrogance had completely drained from his face, replaced by a pale look of panic. He realized that the tables had turned. He had tried to make a fool of the help, and instead, he had turned the help into the star of the evening. He looked around and saw that people were no longer looking at him with respect. They were looking at him with annoyance. He had interrupted the best part of the night with his cruelty. He tried to take a sip of his drink, but his hand was shaking so much, he spilled some more on his tie. "Is that really the server?" Someone whispered nearby. "I think so," another voice replied. "He works on the cleaning crew." "I've seen him mopping the lobby. He's incredible," a woman whispered. The whispers spread like wildfire, but they were quiet, reverent whispers. No one wanted to miss a single note. The music was swelling toward a climax, a series of crashing chords that demanded power. Elias threw his whole body into it. He wasn't holding anything back. He struck the keys with a force that vibrated through the floor. He wasn't the invisible employee anymore. He was the master of the hall Ms. Sterling walked past the tall executive without even acknowledging him. She moved to the front of the crowd, giving herself a clear view of Elias's hands. She watched his technique, his wrist position, his finger strength. It was unpolished, perhaps a bit rough around the edges from lack of recent practice, but it was undeniably brilliant. It was raw talent that couldn't be taught in a school. It was something you were born with. The music slowed down again, teasing the audience, making them think it was over, before launching into a final frantic flurry of notes. It was a race to the finish, a test of endurance. Elias's face glistened with sweat. His arms burned with effort, But he didn't stop. He poured every ounce of his frustration into the keys. Every time he had been ignored, every time he had been mocked, every time he had to skip a meal so he could pay rent, it was all coming out through his fingers. The tall executive took a step back, then another. He wanted to leave. He wanted to disappear into the crowd and pretend he hadn't been the one to challenge Elias. But the crowd was packed tight now, blocking his escape. He was trapped in the middle of the very audience he had tried to impress, forced to witness the humiliation of his own ego. As the music reached its peak, the sound was overwhelming. It filled every corner of the atrium, bouncing off the marble floors and the glass ceilings. It was a wall of sound that washed over the guests, making them feel something real for the first time that night. The cynical, business-focused atmosphere evaporated. For a few minutes, money and status didn't matter. Only the music mattered. Elias hit the final series of chords with a thunderous crash. Then, his hands lifted off the keys, and he held them in the air for a split second. Freezing the moment in time, silence. Absolute. Total silence followed. The echoes of the piano faded away, leaving the room breathless. Elias sat there, his chest heaving, his hands hovering over the keys. He slowly opened his eyes. The trance was broken. He was back in the real world. He was back in the atrium, wearing a wrinkled shirt, sitting on a bench in front of 300 rich strangers. He felt a sudden wave of fear. What had he just done? He had lost control. He had shown them everything. He waited for the laughter to start. He waited for the tall executive to shout, "Okay, show's over, get back to work." But the laughter never came. Instead, from the back of the room, a single pair of hands began to clap. It was a slow, deliberate clap. It was Ms. Sterling. She wasn't clapping because it was polite. She was clapping because she was witnessing greatness. And then, like a dam breaking, the rest of the room erupted. It wasn't just polite applause. It was a roar. People were cheering, whistling, and shouting. The waiters were cheering. The kitchen staff were cheering. The sound was louder than the music had been. It washed over Elias, warm and shocking. He sat there for a moment, stunned. He looked out at the sea of faces. The tall executive was standing near the front, clapping slowly, a look of pure misery on his face. He looked like a man who had just realized he made the worst mistake of his career. Elias stood up slowly. He felt weak in the knees, but his heart was soaring. He turned to face the crowd. He didn't bow like a performing monkey. He just gave a small, respectful nod. He wasn't doing this for their applause. He had done it for the music. He stepped off the platform and walked toward the area where he had left his jacket. The crowd parted for him, but this time, they weren't moving out of the way to avoid him. They were moving to give him space, treating him like someone important. He reached for his jacket, but before he could put it back on, a voice cut through the noise. "Wait," the voice said. It was calm, but it carried the authority of someone who was used to being obeyed. Elias turned around. It was Ms. Sterling. She had walked up to him, leaving her security detail behind. She looked at him not as a CEO looks at an employee, but as one artist looks at another. "Don't put that back on yet," she said, gesturing to the uniform jacket in his hand. "I think we need to talk." The sound that exploded from the piano wasn't just a note. It was a physical force that seemed to slap the arrogance right out of the air. The low, thundering chords of the Hungarian Rhapsody filled the massive atrium. Vibrating through the floorboards and up the legs of the guests, it was a sound that demanded respect, a sound that didn't belong to a waiter or a cleaner. It belonged to a master. For the first few seconds, the tall executive still had a smirk on his face, expecting a clumsy, talky tune that would give him and his friends a good laugh. But as the melody quickly grew complex, twisting and turning with a speed that seemed impossible for human hands, the smirk froze. Then it cracked. Then it vanished completely. Elias didn't look at the audience. He didn't look at the bully. He didn't look at the CEO. His world shrank down to the 88 black and white keys in front of him. His eyes closed, shutting out the fancy lights, the expensive gowns, and the judgment. He was no longer in a corporate office. He was back in his tiny apartment. He was in the practice rooms of his youth. He was in the only place where he ever felt powerful. His left hand began a steady, driving rhythm, heavy and dark, like a heartbeat. His right hand flew across the high keys, playing notes so fast they blurred together. It wasn't just noise. It was a story. It was a story of anger, of being overlooked, of being stepped on. Every strike of the key was a release of the frustration he had swallowed while serving drinks to people who treated him like furniture. The room went completely silent. It wasn't the polite silence of people listening to background music. It was the shocked silence of people realizing they were witnessing something extraordinary. Waiters stopped moving. Glasses remained halfway to lips. The hum of conversation died instantly, replaced by the roar of the piano. The tall executive took a step back, nearly stumbling over his own feet. He looked at the man on the bench, then looked at his friends with a panic-stricken expression. They weren't laughing anymore. They were staring, their mouths slightly open, unable to comprehend what was happening. The man they had mocked as a nobody was playing with a level of skill and passion that most professional musicians they hired couldn't dream of. As the music continued, Elias changed. It wasn't just the sound that was different. It was him. The slouch in his shoulders disappeared. He sat up straight, his body moving with the rhythm, swaying with the emotion of the piece. His face, usually tired and hidden, was intense and alive. In the dim, golden light of the gala, he didn't look like a servant in a cheap shirt. He looked like a king on a throne. He attacked the keys, sometimes gently, whispering secrets to the wood, and other times with fury, making the instruments sing and cry. The music swept through the room, cleaning the air of the petty snobbery that had filled it just moments before. It was raw. It was honest. It was human Ms. Sterling, the CEO, had walked closer to the stage. She had stopped looking at her watch. She wasn't checking her phone or looking for investors to impress. She was standing still, her eyes fixed on Ilias's hands. She knew music. She knew enough to know that this wasn't just playing a song. This was a person pouring their soul out into the open. She saw the tension in his fingers, the sweat forming on his brow, and the sheer force of will he was exerting. She realized with a sudden jolt that she had completely misjudged the man in the uniform. The piece reached a chaotic middle section. The notes were flying everywhere, crashing together in a beautiful storm. It was technically difficult, the kind of section that makes even good pianists mess up. But Elias didn't hesitate. His hands knew the way. They danced over the keys with a confidence that was terrifying to watch. He was playing with a reckless abandon, taking risks, pushing the tempo faster and faster. The guests were mesmerized. The arrogance of the wealthy elite usually acted as a shield, protecting them from having to admire anyone they considered below them. But that shield was breaking. They couldn't deny the talent in front of them. It didn't matter what he was wearing. It didn't matter how much money he had in the bank. The music was true, and truth is something that commands respect, even from the hardest of hearts. Near the bar, the tall executive stood with his arms hanging limply at his sides. His face was red, but this time it wasn't from the alcohol. It was from humiliation. He could feel the eyes of the room darting between him and the pianist. Everyone knew what he had done. Everyone knew he had tried to mock this man. And now, as the music soared to incredible heights, the joke was entirely on him. He looked small. He looked petty. In the face of such raw beauty, his cruelty looked ugly and pathetic. Elias felt a shift in the energy of the room, even with his eyes closed. He could feel the hostility turning into awe. He could feel the judgment turning into respect. It gave him a rush of adrenaline. He pushed the tempo even more, playing the hardest parts of the song with a smile that was almost fierce. He wasn't just playing for them anymore. He was playing for every time he had been ignored. He was playing for every late rent payment. He was playing for the dreams he had packed away in a box under his bed. The grand piano, which had been a silent statue just 10 minutes ago, was now a living, breathing beast. It growled and roared under Elias's command. The sound filled every corner of the atrium, bouncing off the marble walls and the glass ceilings. It was so loud that it vibrated in the chests of the listeners as the music rushed toward its climax. The tension in the room became unbearable. It felt like the air was crackling with electricity. Ilias's hands were a blur, moving so fast they looked like they were powered by magic. The melody was frantic, desperate, and triumphant all at once. Ms. Sterling took another step closer, right to the edge of the platform. She watched Ilias's face. She saw the tears in his eyes, tears he didn't seem to know were there. This wasn't an act. This was a man who had been given a moment to be himself, and he was taking it with everything he had. She felt a rare sensation in her chest, feeling of being moved. She made a mental note, a very important note, that the culture in her company had allowed this kind of talent to be hidden in the shadows. The tall executive couldn't take it anymore. The weight of the staring guests was too much. He mumbled something to his friends and tried to slip away into the crowd, but nobody paid him any attention. He had become invisible. The spotlight had shifted entirely to the stage. Elias was lost in the storm of the music. The outside world had faded away completely. There was no CEO, no bully, no waiters, no rich guests. There was only the vibration of the strings, the smell of the wood, and the incredible joy of letting the music out. He felt powerful. He felt like he could fly. For the first time in years, he wasn't the help. He wasn't a failure. He was Elias the pianist, and he was brilliant. The music began to slow down, building up for the final massive chords. The room held its collective breath. The waiter stopped working entirely, leaning against the walls, drawn in by the magic. It was a moment of pure unity. In that second, money and status didn't exist. There was only the art. Elias lifted his hands high above the keyboard. For a split second, time seemed to stop. He was hovering at the peak, the king of the room, holding the heart of every single person in the palm of his hand. He brought his hands down for the finale, a crash of sound that was destined to end the silence forever. The transformation was complete. The waiter was gone. The artist had arrived. The final chords of the Hungarian Rhapsody crashed through the atrium like a tidal wave hitting the shore. Elias slammed his hands down on the keys with every ounce of strength left in his body, creating a sound that was huge, terrifying, and absolutely beautiful. And then, in a split second, his hands flew up into the air, freezing there as the last vibration of the strings faded into the air. For 5 long seconds, there was absolute silence. It wasn't the quiet of an empty room. It was the heavy, shocked silence of 300 people who had just seen a ghost. No one breathed. No one moved. The air in the room felt electric, like the moment after a lightning strike. Elias sat on the bench, his chest heaving up and down, sweat dripping down his temple. His hands were trembling slightly, not from fear, from the adrenaline rushing through his veins. Slowly he opened his eyes. He was back in the real world. The golden lights, the marble floors, the expensive perfume, it all came rushing back. But everything looked different now. The people weren't looking through him anymore. They were looking at him. The silence was broken by a single clap. It was sharp and deliberate. Everyone turned their heads. It was Ms. Sterling. She was standing right at the edge of the platform, her purse tucked under her arm, a look of fierce admiration on her face. She didn't clap like a polite audience member. She clapped like a conductor who had just heard the perfect symphony. That was all it took. The dam broke. The room exploded into applause. It wasn't just the polite clapping you hear at boring business meetings. It was a roar. People started whistling, shouting bravo, and stomping their feet. Waiters stopped serving to clap. The investors stood on their tiptoes to see the pianist. The sound washed over Elias, warm and healing, washing away the years of feeling small and invisible. Elias sat there for a moment, stunned. He couldn't believe it. He had expected them to ignore him, or maybe to just go back to their drinks. But this was respect. He took a deep, shaky breath and stood up. He bowed slightly, not too low, just a respectful nod to the room. He saw the faces in the front row. They were glowing. The arrogance had been replaced by awe. Then his eyes found the tall executive in the gray suit. The man looked pale. He was standing near the back of the crowd, his drink forgotten in his hand. He wasn't clapping. He looked like he wanted the floor to open up and swallow him whole. His friends were looking at him with disgust, then turning back to clap for Elias. The bully had been defeated, not with fists, but with talent. He looked small, weak, and pathetic. Elias looked him in the eye, and for the first time that night, the executive looked away. Elias turned to walk off the stage, thinking his moment was over. He wanted to go back to the shadows, to catch his breath, to process what had just happened. But as he stepped down from the platform, a path cleared in the crowd. People stepped aside, not out of fear, but out of respect. They wanted to let him pass. Miss Sterling stepped into his path. Elias stopped immediately. "Miss Sterling," he said, his voice raspy, I apologize if I disturbed the event. I will go back to my station now." He turned to pick up his jacket, but she reached out and gently touched his arm. "You are not going back to your station," she said. Her voice was calm, but it carried the authority of someone who is used to being obeyed. Elias looked at her confused. "Ma'am?" "That was the most inspiring thing I have heard in this building in 10 years, she said, looking him straight in the eyes. She didn't look at him like a waiter. She looked at him like an equal. "Who are you really? And why are you serving drinks instead of playing on a stage?" Elias felt a lump form in his throat. He didn't know how to answer. I'm Elias. I work on the cleaning crew. I needed the job." Miss Sterling's expression darkened slightly, not at him, but at the situation. "We have a master pianist scrubbing floors while we hire mediocre entertainers?" She shook her head, disappointed in her own company. "That is a waste." Behind them, the tall executive tried to slip away into the crowd, hoping to escape the scene of his humiliation. "And him," Miss Sterling said, pointing a well-manicured finger at the retreating back of the bully, "the man who mocked you. He is the head of the department that handles hiring, isn't he?" "Yes, ma'am," Elias said softly. "Ms." Sterling turned to one of her assistants. "Make sure his office is cleared out by morning. I don't pay people to treat talent like garbage." She turned back to Elias, her expression softening. "I am sorry you had to endure that. That is not the kind of culture I want in this company." Elias stood there, stunned. He had expected to be fired for touching the piano, or maybe yelled at for causing a scene. Instead, the CEO was firing the bully and apologizing to him. It felt surreal. "Look," Miss Sterling said, "I know it's late, and I know you've had a long night. But I am not letting you walk out of here thinking you are just a cleaner. I have an arts foundation. We fund scholarships for young musicians. We also sponsor performances. I am short a director for the program, and I have been looking for someone who understands the struggle, someone who has real passion." Elias's eyes widened. You want me to work for you? As a director?" "I want you to do what you just did," she said firmly. "I want you to bring that fire to my foundation. The pay is 5 times what you make now, and you don't have to wear a uniform." She handed him a card with her personal number on it. "Call me tomorrow. My schedule assistant will clear a slot for you. Don't make me chase you, Elias." Elias took the card. It felt heavy, like it was made of gold. He looked at the piano, then back at the most powerful woman in the city. I will call you," he promised. "Thank you," she smiled, a genuine, warm smile that made her look years younger. "No, thank you. You saved the party." Sterling walked away, her assistant rushing behind her with a phone. The crowd began to disperse, buzzing with excitement about the mystery pianist. People were asking each other, "Who was that? And did you see his hands?" Elias walked over to the small table where he had left his tray and his jacket. He slowly put his uniform jacket back on. It still felt cheap and scratchy against his skin, but it didn't feel like a cage anymore. It was just clothes. He picked up the tray. The arrogant executive was gone, vanished into the night, likely worrying about his career. The other servers were looking at Elias with wide eyes, grinning at him. They gave him thumbs up and patted him on the back as he walked through the kitchen doors. He wasn't invisible to them either. He was a hero. He was the guy who stood up to the boss and played like an angel. Elias walked out of the building and into the cool night air. The city lights were blinking and the traffic was humming. The world felt different. It felt bigger, full of possibilities that weren't there before. He touched his pocket to make sure the card was still there. He looked up at the tall skyscraper one last time. The piano inside was silent now, sitting in the empty hall. But the music had changed everything. The man who had walked in as a ghost was walking out as a man with a future. He took a deep breath of the cold air and smiled for the first time in a long time. The real song was just beginning.